Good evening, everyone. Tonight's talk. Ralph Allen is somebody who's always intrigued me because he wasn't an extrovert like Beau Nash. He wasn't a self-publicist like John Wood. And he essentially, he quietly made money from, he claimed Bathstone. We think probably in reality it's from the postal system because he controlled the whole country's postal system apart from the roads going in and out of London. And he ended up owning not just Widcombe, but through his wife Bathampton, and also the land over the top in between. And the question is, on that land, he built Sham Castle, which is what tonight's talk about. But he only built the front of it. And before too long, people started wondering why he'd done it. And there was a story did the rounds that it was so he could see it from the townhouse that he had down in the city. Now, people have cast doubt on that, and that's really what the talk tonight is about. So I'm going to introduce Mike now. Mike came to Bath 30 years ago. The MOD brought him here, and then since then you've become a Mayor's Guide, and like a lot of us, the more he's found out about the history of Bath, the more questions are raised, and the more you look into it. So he's looked at all the evidence about Sham Castle, and tonight we'll hear whether or not it's true that Sham Castle was built so that Ralph Allen could see it from his townhouse. So over to you, Mark. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Paul. Well, if you look up most of the references about Sham Castle, it will say that it was built as an eyecatcher for Ralph Allen's townhouse. So if you look at Historic England, you look at Wikipedia, you look at the Pevsner Guide, that's what they all say. But as Paul said, a number of people have had doubts about it. So this evening what I'd like to do is to say a little bit about the history of those buildings and the evidence and whether it supports it or not. The one thing I would say is that all the information tends to be ambiguous, contradictory and confusing, typical of anything in history. But a little bit, first of all, on the locations. You probably all know where they are, but just in case there's any doubt, Sham Castle is up there on Hampton Down or Bathampton Down, very prominent. By contrast, the townhouse is hidden away. It's tucked away in behind Toppings in York Street and behind 1 and 2 North Parade Passage and behind Terrace Walk and Bridgewater House. And so those are the two locations. Other places which I'll be mentioning this evening are London Road, which is up here, Lansdowne Road, and Lower Bristol Road. So a little bit of background. Ralph Allen came to Bath in the early 18th century, and by 1720 he was living in numbers 1 and 2 North Parade Passage, or Lilliput Alley as it was known at the time, the buildings which are here on the left. And that was his post office. He'd come here as the postal clerk, but he worked himself up to become the postmaster. And in 1720, he established a contract with the government to run the cross-country post, and he would do that for 7 years in the southwest of England. In 1726, he went on to start buying land for the quarries and buying the quarry rights as well, up on the downs, Claverton Down, Combe Down, etc. 1727 was a very important year for him because then he got a new contract, another 7-year contract for running the cross-country post, and he continued to do that throughout his life, every 7 years. So that was important. He also consolidated all the local postal services into numbers 1 and 2 North Parade Passage, and he was a shareholder and treasurer of the Avon Navigation, which opened in 1727. And that established a route from Bath to Bristol, a water route which made Bath, in effect, an inland port. And by not only get to Bristol, but you get the open seas as well. And as a result of that, he could export his stone down to Bristol and further afield, and also, very important, timber could be imported to Bath easily for the building. And of course, he was interested in the building going on here because it was using his stone. In 1731, he passed the ownership of the house on to his younger brother, Philip, and Philip gradually took over a lot of the postal work as a result of that. In 1728, Ralph Allen tendered to provide bath stone for Greenwich Hospital in London. It was rejected as being unsuitable, which annoyed him a little bit and made him determined to build something really impressive in Bath to show what a fine material it is. And that thing that he built, of course, that's just saying that its stone was rejected. And the thing which he built was Prior Park, built 1734 to 1743, and he moved in probably about 1741. And Sham Castle was built about 1762, so very much later. And as we've sort of hinted at, there are doubts as to whether it was built as an eye-catcher for the townhouse. And there are various reasons for that. The first one is that if you go up there now, you will see that the view between the two is blocked, largely blocked, by what we now call Bridgewater House, number 2 Terrace Walk. And since Bridgewater House was almost certainly built before Sham Castle, you were never going to be able to see between the two. The second one is that by the time Sham Castle was built, Prior Park had been built, and that's where Ralph Allen had been living for about 20 years. So he didn't really need to have an eye catcher from a townhouse that he wasn't living in. And people have pointed that out before. A couple of mayors, Dennis Calley and Connie Smith, have pointed that out before. So nothing particularly new there. Another factor was that the townhouse itself, we think of it being a smart resident of the town. In fact, Elizabeth Holland and others suggested in 2008 that it was really built as a block of offices rather than a residence. And the fourth reason is that when you look at Sham Castle, it doesn't face directly towards the townhouse, it faces directly towards the end of London Road, where Hayes Furniture Shop is now. Now, we need to look at the evidence for all that and see whether the evidence supports what I've just said. So we'll start with Sham Castle. The earliest reference I can find to it is a letter that William Pitt, the elder, friend at the time of Ralph Allen, wrote to somebody called Sanderson Miller, inviting him to design a Gothic structure to go on the hills. And Sanderson Miller was the famous designer of Gothic follies. So he's the top man to go to for the job. So that's 1755, which gives us a sort of baseline for when we think Sham Castle was built after. We also have some autobiographical notes that Richard Jones, who was Ralph Allen's clerk of works, wrote about his life, in which he says that in 1762 he began work on the castle on the Warren. Now, there may be slight doubts about the date, and it's also a fairly rambling document, but it's quite important because it's the only real account we got of the building of Sham Castle. And he talks about the castle in the Warren. Well, on the top of Hampton Down, or Barthampton Down, there used to be a rabbit warren. And to look after the rabbit warren, they had a warrener. And he lived in a little hut or little cottage on the western side of the warren. When Ralph Allen acquired the land there, he didn't need a rabbit warren any longer, and he planted it with fir trees, making a fir plantation up there. But the warrener's cottage and the warrener remained there in this little cottage on the western side. And the warrener's cottage remained there until 1749. In 1748, the last occupant of the warrener's cottage, Richard Biggs, brutally murdered his wife there. And as a result of that, Ralph Allen had his house demolished and razed to the ground because it was becoming a bit of a tourist attraction. So he had it razed to the ground. And it was on that site that Sham Castle was built. So we know it can't have been built before 1749, so that gives us a date. Now, if you want to know more about Barthampton Down, the Warren and the murder and everything else, there's a book, Barthampton Down, A Hill Divided, by Mary Clark and Gillian Huggins, which you can get out of the library. I'm not sure that you can buy one any longer. Fascinating, fascinating book. And one of the things that they point out there is that there was a field very close to the site of Sham Castle, which was called Sham Down before Sham Castle was built. So it is undoubtedly a sham castle, but there was a sham reference in the area already. Now, there is a little sort of grisly reminder of the murder in BRLSI. When Richard Biggs was caught and convicted, he was hanged up at Odd Down, and his body was hung in irons from a gibbet. The gibbet, and it was cut down at some stage from the gibbet, thrown in the river, eventually recovered. And the irons, the gibbet cap bit of it, the head bit of it, was recovered, and it is in the BRLSI collection. We haven't got it out this evening, don't worry, we haven't got it out this evening, but you can look it up online. I understand it was on display last year for the 200th anniversary of BRLSI. Now, another thing which is in there, you will see a reference to a lower long pile facing the London Road. That was never built, but when you look at Sham Castle and its alignment, it faces London Road. It doesn't face the townhouse. So it appears that in the building of Sham Castle, they have made it face towards a London Road. And the most interesting thing about this is what he doesn't say. He doesn't make any mention of it being an eye catcher for the townhouse, which you would expect him to do. He's saying all about what he's done and how he designed it, which he didn't really do, and things like that. But he doesn't say what it was built as an eye catcher, which suggests to me it was not built as an eye catcher. And added to that, as we'll see later, Richard Jones may have been involved in the building, if not of the townhouse, the rebuilding of buildings next to it. So he would have known all about it. This is a picture of a map which was drawn up for Ralph Allen of his estate, and that shows the fir plantation there, the old Warren, and anybody who's involved with the golf course knows that Barthampton Warren are up there. And then that little rectangle there is where the Warrener's cottage was. And if you look at the map in detail, there is no sign there of Sham Castle itself. However, if you look at the margins of this map, this large map, it is shown there, the castle at the Warren. And that's a good diagram of what they were going to build. The letter E at the bottom is not east, it just happens to be building E on their diagram, but there we are. So clearly they had thinking about designing it and everything else, but it's not shown on the map itself. The earliest picture I've got that shows Sham Castle is this one. It's the southwest prospect of Bath, dated to 1757, and up here in the right-hand corner, which you probably can't quite see at the moment, is the Sham Castle. So 1757, whoever did that engraving was aware that the castle was going to be built up there. He doesn't get it exactly right, but he knows that it's there. Now, quite often people put in artist's impression of things before they're constructed. So 1757, possibly it was there, possibly it wasn't. Sham Castle was built, and that's a picture of it rather later, 1844. It had nearly been demolished a few years earlier because they wanted to build an Anglican Queen's College up there, but they never got beyond the foundations. So the Sham Castle was preserved, and it continued in rather untidy condition by then. It was refurbished in 1880, and then in 1920, the land was sold off. And the farmer bought the land, including Sham Castle, which he really rather wanted to get rid of. He put it up for auction, nobody would buy it, but in the end, the city bought it with money raised by Richard Otley and Arthur Withy, who was one of the founders of Withy King, the solicitors. And they generously found the money to buy it and also to refurbish it and repair it and to put a fence round. And to celebrate that, or to recognise that, there is a plaque on the castle just above the arch. And the date of 1762 is set in stone on that. Whether it's quite right or not, we're not sure. But certainly, probably late 1750 to 1762, that sort of time span. Now, the view from it, which you get now, is shown here. And we have down, that is Elton House in Abbey Green, North Parade Passage, which you probably recognise, the Huntsman Inn, Bridgewater House, the Ale House, and the entrance to York Street, which would not have been there in 1762, because that area was occupied by the assembly rooms built by Humphrey Thayer, also known as Lindsay's, or also known as Wiltshire's rooms. And then you've got Terrace Walk going along there. So that's what it looked like from the top, just in front. And then if we zoom in, there is Bridgewater House, and behind it you can just see the pediment and the roof of Ralph Allen's townhouse. Only just, with some difficulty. Now, I will confess, I didn't climb the castle. You can't do that, or not legally anyway. So if you went to the top of the castle, you would always get a slightly better view, but I don't think you would get an eye-catcher view when you was looking in the opposite direction. So I think that says that certainly with Bridgewater House being where it is, you can't see effectively between the two. So the question is, what was Bridgewater House doing in 1762, or the late 1750s? Well, that is a picture painted on a fan by Thomas Robbins and dated to 1752 to 53. You're never quite sure of this, but that's the date that's shown. And here we have the old assembly rooms, Harrison, and next to it we have the ones built by Humphrey Thayer, and then here we have Bridgewater House. And you can see it's quite a tall, substantial building. Now, does Bridgewater House now look the same as it did then? Well, if we compare them, I think they are very, very similar. You can look, even the windows in the roof are the same, the little gap in the parapet there, everything. So it doesn't appear to have changed. So if that picture is accurate for 1753, then, or 52, 53, and Sham Castle was built in 1762, you couldn't have seen between the two. There's also a plan from John Wood's essay toward a description of Bath, drawn in 1749, and again that shows Humphrey Thayer's rooms, or Lindsay's or Wiltshire's, and it shows what we now call Bridgewater House, getting in the way of the view from Ralph Allen's townhouse. So looking at all those, that suggests that there wasn't a view between the two. But let's go have a look at some of the other information. This is a view from Abbey Green, looking along North Parade Passage. And if you looked along the far end, you would just about be able to see Sham Castle behind the trees. Now, the building on the corner, the chocolate shop, was built about 1762. But the buildings beyond it, which are 1 and 2 North Parade Passage, long to as far as Sallylund, and the building beyond it, were built in the 1620s. So very old buildings, some of the oldest ones within the city itself. And originally, North Parade Passage would have led at the far end down to the Abbey Orchard. So at the far end, it would have gone down. Now, because North Parade has been built, it goes up at the far end. Opposite number 1 and 2 North Parade Passage is Lilliput Court, and that is much lower. It's about 10 steps down from the passageway. And that's 1 and 2 North Parade Passage. And that is where Ralph Allen came by 1720 to operate his post office and where he was living. And you've got number 1 on the left, which is 2 bays wide, and number 2 on the right, which is 3 bays wide. And you will see that it's got a typical Georgian ashlar stone front, because it was refronted, probably by John Wood the Elder, in the 1727, 1730, something like that. He refronted it and put an attic on the top as well. There is a view from somebody, I think it was Jean Manco, that these buildings originally faced the opposite way when they were built in 1620. And this was originally the back, it's now the front. Doesn't really matter, but that, I just throw that in as another idea. So let's go around and look at the little courtyard, which is behind Toppings. I don't know how many of you have been in there at some stage, but it's quite interesting to go and have a look. And we've got a building there, which is number 2 North Parade Passage. And then number 1 is tucked round the back. And you can see that number 2 projects towards us by quite a lot, because they've built an extension on the back of number 2. At the same time, they put the attic floor on the top. And next to it is what is called Ralph Allen's townhouse. And Elizabeth Holland, Mike Chapman, Peter Bailey, and John Hawkes, I think it was, did a lot of study in 2008 on these buildings. And the conclusions that they came to were, firstly, that Ralph Allen's townhouse was not suitable as a gentleman's residence. It wasn't really big enough. It was basically one room on top of another. And their view was that it was probably built as a set of offices. And that makes sense, because 1727, Ralph Allen, he let his second contract for the cross-country post. He consolidated all the postal work into North Parade Passage. He'd started buying up all the stone quarry. He'd opened the Avon navigation. He needed office space, so it would make sense to build more office space. And also, he'd given his house to his brother Philip, so it was probably getting a little bit crowded. He just didn't want to be doing all the work from the kitchen table there. The other conclusion they came to was that these two buildings were never properly connected together. There's little few signs of it, but nothing very much. And they also came to the conclusion that Ralph Allen's townhouse was not designed by John Wood the Elder. Who designed it, they open to some discussion. The paperwork, if you want to read about it, it's all available online. Now, I mentioned earlier Richard Jones being involved with it. This is what Richard Jones said in his autobiographical notes. He said the first heap of work was 2 houses in the Abbey Green. Well, the only 2 houses they could have been were a couple of the 3 which I've mentioned, either 1 and 2 North Parade Passage or the townhouse or something like that. So he was clearly working in this area when the townhouse was being put up, which makes it, again, very strange that when he was talking about the Sham Castle, he doesn't mention it being an eye-catcher, if it genuinely was. The other thing, when you look at those buildings, and I'll just go back to them, is they have an unfinished look to them, don't they? And you just wonder, what was Ralph Allen planning to do? Now, somebody called Henry Van Lansdowne solved the problem over 100 years later by producing this picture, which is the one which you'll probably find if you do a search on Google for Ralph Allen's townhouse. And it shows the buildings, as it were, completed, with particularly a northern wing there, and the gaps filled in between the buildings. Now, none of that actually happened. And it's possible there was never an intention. I just wonder whether when Ralph Allen started out, he had some vague intention to expand it a little bit further, but decided not to. And there were good reasons why he wouldn't. One is he didn't own the land on the right here. The second one was it was all getting a little bit built up with the building of the assembly rooms and things like that. And the third one was that by this time he was heavily engaged in building Prior Park. And the last thing he wanted to do is divert resources to building something he wasn't really very interested in. So for whatever reason, this never happened. And this picture is a complete fantasy. So why did Ralph Allen build the Sham Castle if he didn't wanted as an eye catcher for the townhouse. Well, wherever you go in Bath, you can see Sham Castle. This is a view from the old cattle market. And if you were coming into Bath, it is one of the things which had greeted you. And I think he was just building something there which was promoting Bath, welcome to Bath, something nice for people to look at, have a bit of fun, but not for his own pleasure. He got Prior Park. Gosh, he got enough things to look at in Prior Park without building an eye catcher. So he got plenty of things to look at. But this is really a gift to everyone, as it were. And also a bit of an advertisement for Bath Stone on the quiet as well. And if you look at it, if you look at the right-hand side, you can see that right-hand wall. So in other words, even at the old cattle market, we're not seeing it square on. To see it square on, you'd have to go up to where Hayes is now. You can't see it from there, but you'd have to go up there. So that's one view. And it is a winter view. You wouldn't be able to see it like that in the summer. Another very important road in Bath is Lansdowne Road, which was the road to Oxford, Gloucester and the north, an important route into Bath. And it is just about possible on occasion to see Sham Castle from Lansdowne Road. And here you are seeing it absolutely square on. And if you can imagine Lansdowne Road before all the houses were built, before St. Stephen's Church and all the rest was built, coming down there, you would see Sham Castle in white set against the fir plantation there. If you were coming in on the Bristol Road, Lower Bristol Road, you would see it as well. That is probably somewhere close to where Windsor Bridge is now. And up on the horizon, you have got the fir plantation on a very bare down at that point. If you zoom in a little bit, you can see there's the Abbey. And I don't know whether you can see that there. Just about see it, slightly closer, in the middle. It is there. It's okay to believe me, it's there, you know. And of course, if you were down on the parades, that's a view from North Parade Bridge, and you've got Sham Castle up again on a fairly bare down, and then just down here you've got the railway bridge and a railway train going along the railway line there. So that's a view from North Parade Bridge in 1850. Now keep that image in mind when we look at the little quotation I'm going to show you. And that is from James Tunstall's Rambles Around Bath. Now, he probably picked up this story from somebody else. And he seems, to be honest, a little bit confused about it, because he's talking about Ralph Allen having a pleasing prospect from his dwelling on the parade. Well, by the time Sham Castle was built, Ralph Allen didn't live on the parade. In fact, he probably never lived on the parade, so he's a little bit confused there. But what we do have is beginning to the idea of the Sham Castle being a bit of an eye catcher from somewhere down on the parade. It wasn't the townhouse, and James Tunstall knew all about the townhouse because 4 pages earlier, he'd said, in an alley behind the Freemasons' Hall stands Ralph Allen's townhouse. So he knew about the townhouse. He seems a little bit confused, but we're getting the ideas coming together of the Sham Castle being an eye catcher for Ralph Allen's dwelling. Nearly 50 years later, we've got R.E.M. Peach saying that the house commanded a view of the bare Hampton Down, that's Ralph Allen's townhouse, of the bare Hampton Down, which some few years later, Richard Jones erected what is now Sham Castle. He doesn't actually say it is built as an eye catcher, because he does say some years later. He says some few years later, it's actually about 30 years later, but he does correctly recognize that Sham Castle was built at a later stage. But anybody reading that casually would imagine that it was built as an eye catcher. So that, and interestingly, Walter Eisen in his book on Georgian building uses a similar wording of built later. And finally, we do have one which puts the two together. And that's a Bath and County Graphics article about the golf club. And I think the golf club had been established on the Down in about 1881. And he says there that Ralph Allen built it about 1730 as an ornamental feature he surveyed from his townhouse. So clearly putting it in as the eye catcher. But they've got the date wrong. If it had been built in 1730, that arguably would have been the case, because you would have been able to see between the two, and it might have been built as an eye catcher. But it wasn't, it was built very much later. So, what have we got at the end of all that? We've got, I think, no evidence that it was built as an eye catcher, and lots of evidence that it could have been. It couldn't have been. And I think what we've got is a charming but erroneous tale, which through constant repetition has become accepted fact. And what we have is Ralph Allen really doing something for everybody rather than his own personal gain, and something that everybody can enjoy, as indeed we do, except now the trees are growing up, it's a little bit difficult to see, but there we are. And I'd like to just finish by acknowledging all the help I've had, and I think probably number one, Bath Record Office is the one who deserved the greatest praise for all of us who keep diving in there and asking them awkward questions. So thank you very much indeed, ladies and gentlemen. If you've got any questions, please ask them now. Oh, wait for the microphone, yeah.
I think that's working, yeah. So do we have any questions? I'll ask one, actually. You said R.E.M. Peach referred to Bearhampton Down, but in the earlier picture, it seemed to be when Sham Castle was built, there were trees. The fir trees were still there, weren't they? So it wasn't quite as bare as he was suggesting. It
was certainly bare in 1850. I can't remember when the trees were cut down. Was it the 1790s or something like that? The trees were cut down for pit props and things like that. It's certainly fairly bare in this picture, which was 1801.
So he was wrong about it being bare, basically.
Sorry?
Peach was wrong about it being built because the top of the hill was bare.
I think when he said the bare down, I think possibly, let's see, that doesn't command a view of the Bearhampton Down. I mean, I would certainly say that that is the view which Tunstall had, and it's pretty bare, isn't it, compared with what it is now?
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think it's completely bare on the top, no. But I think the fir trees have probably gone by then. I think they'll be cut down for pit props and things like that.
Yeah, okay, right. So do we have any other questions in the room? Well, let me, can I pass this to you?
Thank you very much. A lot of commercial companies have flats and show houses and showrooms to advertise their products. Is it possible that he was advertising his product, especially as it was facing the London Road and the Lansdowne, going to Gloucester and that part of the country?
What do you mean,
and
with Sham Castle, do you mean?
Especially given that his stone had been turned down by the hospital in London.
I mean, it has been said that Sham Castle was there to show that you could build lovely Gothic buildings out of Bath stone as opposed to just Georgian buildings. But by the time Sham Castle was built, there were plenty of Bath stone buildings in the city, with Queen Square and the Circus, not yet Royal Crescent, but quite a number of buildings, I think. But I think there is also a view that the townhouse was designed to show the marvellous things that you could carve into Bath stone. Yeah, and I'm sure he was constantly trying to advertise and promote his product. Show? Show, yeah. Yeah. Sorry? Yes, yeah, yeah. And of course, his other great work, Prior Park, was demonstrating that as well. Yes, I think there was a view, one of the complaints for Greenwich Hospital was that it wasn't a very strong material. It was like Cheshire cheese or something like that. And putting it, the Sham Castle up on the top of the hill in a fairly exposed position showed that it could really withstand the weather and everything, yes.
Firstly, let me say that I have climbed Sham Castle. When the scaffolding was up there about 1990, when they were, I took my sons up there, so when they're old men, they can say, I climbed Sham Castle. I'm from Sussex. Not that makes me a less than law-abiding citizen, I hasten to add. And there is a character in the history of Sussex called Mad Jack Fuller, who built a lot of follies. And as a child, we were taught he built the follies at times of agricultural depression because he had money and it was a way of providing work for out-of-work labourers. Is there any possibility that Alan did that?
I don't know. All I will say is that every time anybody builds a folly, somebody says it's done for the benefit of the workers and to employ them. And you sometimes wonder whether they wouldn't have done better building schools or almshouses or something else. But maybe I'm being a little bit cynical about that. I don't know.
We got a question online. Was Pryor Park also visible from the centre of Bath at that time, or could the view of that as an advert have been blocked at some time in the run-up to the building of Sham Castle?
Pryor Park was very visible, and it's still visible now. It would have been more visible in those days. And of course, one of the things about Pryor Park is that unlike a lot of gentlemen's country residences in the 18th century, it was built to be seen. And what you see today is actually the back of the house, and the front doesn't look as good because he's trying to advertise. He certainly was trying to advertise his stuff. But if you were coming in, say, on the London Road, you would see, first of all, Sham Castle, and then you would see Pryor Park. So it would definitely be very visible. When I say coming in on the London Road, of course, as long as you weren't in a closed carriage facing back or something like that, you had to be on your horse or the coachman or whatever.
Right, do we have any more questions? Yes.
Hi, Mike. Thank you for your wonderful deduction of Sham Castle not being an eyecatcher for townhouse. So can I just check with you? I think you said that some of the land up there was called Sham Down.
Sham Down, yeah.
Okay, so that is really interesting because I always assumed that Sham Castle, you know, the name related to the fact that it was a folly. So that's a bit of a myth buster.
I think it did, but I think by a happy coincidence, there was a Sham Down there.
Okay.
And there is actually a picture in this splendid, or a map in this splendid book, which you can have a look at later, which shows it as Sham Down. What Sham Down means, I have no idea.
Oh, that was my next question then.
So I've tried to look it up. I'm a shambles in the town means something, but sham, as in Sham Down, I don't know. I mean, I think if you were designing a castle, you wouldn't give it the name Sham Castle. You would say it's the castle in the Warren, or Mr. Allen's Castle, or Hampton Castle, or something like that. You wouldn't put it up and say, oh, I'm going to call it Sham Castle. I think that's just a name people applied to it, probably fairly quickly. And it's interesting, a couple of the quotes, they say, now called Sham Castle or something. So obviously at the start it was called Castle in the Warren or something like that.
I was so happy that you showed a picture from the cattle market, because every time I walk past there, I notice what a spectacular view it is. And I think under-recognised of Sham Castle from there over the old jail on Grove Street. We are about to, one of the other sort of really good views to Sham Castle, we're about to quite significantly impair in the next year. And they're planning to develop the cattle market. And I've seen very little recognition of the importance of that view. Are we expecting that as potentially the best remaining view to be preserved, or do we think it's a hopeless case?
To be honest, I have no idea. I wasn't really aware of the development of the cattle market and the impact. I've been aware of the development of the recreation ground and the impact of that on the views and things like that, but not the cattle market. It's Walcott Street. Yeah, if you go out beyond the Hilton Hotel, that's the tram shed, and it's just before you get to the tram shed, yeah. But it's the last point going out in that direction where you can see Sham Castle. But obviously in earlier days, it would have been visible probably quite a long way along London Road. And from the references to building the house, putting the other structure facing London Road and Hampton, it suggests to me that they wanted it to be visible to those who were coming from London.
Thank you for a really interesting talk, by the way. It might just be my ignorance. I don't know of anything else like this in the rest of the UK. Was this unprecedented? Was this new? Or was this taken from somewhere else?
Well, I think there are quite a few other follies around the place, and Sanderson Miller had a reputation for designing them. In many cases, they were actually within people's country estates. And there is also a reference, Benjamin Boyce, who wrote the biography of Ralph Allen, mentions that in Henry Fielding's Tom Jones, Squire Allworthy, who is modelled on Ralph Allen, has a view from his house of the ruined abbey in the background. So there was this sort of thing in the 18th century of either having a genuine ruin to look at, or if you hadn't got a genuine ruin, you built one.
Right, we have a question here.
Could it be a memorial, sorry my voice, to that lady that was killed? A memorial?
Sorry?
I think my neighbour is asking if it could be a memorial to the woman who was murdered.
I don't think so, no. I mean, I got the impression from the way that they raised the building to the ground, they wanted to obliterate any reference to it at all. I don't think so. I've seen nothing at all. No.
I'm just going to add a little bit to what I know you think is a much too gory story to talk about. But when Richard Biggs was hung, he was actually hung opposite where I live now, but it drew a crowd apparently of some 20,000 people and was a completely notorious event because of the way things had happened. And as Mike mentioned, the house where it had happened did become basically a tourist attraction, and that's why it was raised. And Ralph Allen just wanted to get rid of crowds coming to gawp at it.
Thank you. Got one at the back.
Thank you for the wonderful presentation. Has the Sham Castle ever been mentioned in any novel, and has it ever appeared in any film?
I don't know, to be honest. I don't know. I'm not the expert on novels, as my wife, who's in the audience, will tell you. I don't know whether she's found anything at all. No, shaking her head there. I don't know. I don't know, I'm afraid.
Can I just pass you the microphone?
So I'm from Glasgow, and I was thinking about moving to Bath, and I randomly found a book on my Amazon Kindle called The Frequency of Us, and it was set in Bath, and the two main characters spoke a lot about the Lower Bristol Road and seeing Sham Castle and how they used to meet there, and it brought them together. And for me, that was a sign to move to Bath. So it has featured in a book.
Thank you.
Right, have you, I ought to just check, there's nothing else online? Oh, I think there might be, just have a look. a comment. Apparently in Ireland, sham meant pal or something similar.
Me?
Pal, friend,
Friend, pal.
or something, yeah. It was used this way in Vanity Fair in 1848. So you learned something, actually, didn't you? It's more than just Sham Castle. Any other questions? Yeah.
Not a question, but a comment. Overlooking Oban, there is a very large structure like the Colosseum, which I understand was built to provide work for unemployed people, for an affluent banker, should we say.
Yeah.
So certainly that sort of thing was done at times to provide work.
Well, I know they built roads in Ireland and things like that to provide employment. A number of the follies that are put up seem to be, at least in part, for the gratification of the person having them put up, if you know what I mean.
Right, well, if there are no further questions, I think I'd just like to say, Mike, that was great. You know, it's good to go through the evidence, and hopefully, if it was a myth, and it's certainly looking that way, perhaps it'll be put to bed. But if you hear it again, it's time to, you can correct the person who's saying it. So thank you, Mike. Thank you very much.